Oh,
Hi,
hello, Shavua Tov.
Shabbat Tov. How are you?
How are you?
You know, getting ready for another day tomorrow night.
Exactly, exactly. So I don't know if it's going to be just you and me. We wait a couple minutes, but
Okay.
I'm getting a lot of pushback from my family. They want me to help them, so we're going to do an abbreviated daf, I think.
No problem. I've done it already, but I could I could hear a couple more insights. So,
Okay, oh, Hanan's here, so we'll do it together. I think the three of us. Um, what's today's Mem Aleph, right?
um, yes, today is Mem Aleph.
Okay. Um,
Actually, that's a short one.
it is a short one. Hello, Hanan. We said we're going to do a short daf today because I have to go help my family clean up for Pesach.
Oh yeah, no, it's not. Yeah. Okay.
Even though there are a lot of very exciting things from yesterday's daf, but hopefully everyone learned it. It's very practical daf about washing on Yom Tiv, washing on Shabbos, going swimming.
I made my way through it.
I'm sorry?
I made my way through it.
Yeah, there's a lot of important things.
The oil.
But we're going to start, let's start at the top line of Mem Aleph, just so, and we'll do this, it won't take us that long. So the next topic, this is a Agadata. Remember what we discussed yesterday, the reason we're bringing this is that we were talking about stories, that they watched other people do things. And so Reb Zera here has another story. So top line, Amar Rabbi Zera, Anach Hazite Rabbi Avo. I watched Rabbi Avo, I guess was his teacher, Shehiniach Yadav Klape Keneged Panav Shamata. That he would put his hands to cover his genitals. So when he went to the mikvah or went swimming or in a bathhouse, I saw him covering himself up, and it was noticeable that he did it. Said Reb Zera, V'lo yadana inaga ilo naga. I don't know if he touched himself or didn't touch himself. Meaning, all I saw was that he put his hands down there. I didn't see what he did with his hands, so I don't know what he did. Says, well, what kind of question is that? Pshita, the lo naga. Of course, he didn't touch himself. Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kola ochez ba'ama. Anyone who touches his penis when he mashtin and urinates, kilo mevima bulolam. It's like bringing a flood to the world, which is interesting imagery. But as Rashi explains, we've had this in Nida, we had this recently, and will in 7 years, right? That the reason is that this is part of the concern that the rabbis had, which we discussed in Nida at great length, about shichvat zera, about spilling semen unnecessarily, and so they were very mocked that someone shouldn't touch themselves because it might lead to them becoming aroused and ultimately having carry. And so that, of course, the Gemara in Nida said was one of the sins of the mabul. So either way, you shouldn't touch yourself. So clearly, he didn't touch himself when he was doing this. Says the Gemara. Well, we don't know that for sure because Amar Abaya, it's possible that asu kiboleshet, that we are treating this like the boleshet. Boleshet is like the FBI, the investigators. Back in the old days, maybe some people think this today. It was not a pleasant experience to be visited by the boleshet, right? They were basically troops that could come and do whatever they wanted to do. There were no checks. They stole and did everything bad. And what we learned in a Braita, it's a Mishnah. Now, let's say you have a boleshet shenichnas l'ir. You have a troop of soldiers who come into a city to investigate or whatever. Bishat shalom, if it's a time of peace, and Rashi says it means that if they're from the same city or from the same government and they're coming not as part of a war, so then chaviot ptuchot asurot. Any open barrels of wine are asur after they come, because you have to assume that they just took whatever they wanted to, and like any non-Jews who take wine, you have to be concerned about yain nesech. That maybe they, poured the wine out for their god, and then they made all the wine yain nesech. Stumot. If the barrels were sealed, then of course mutarot, because they didn't open the seal. But continues the Mishnah. This is why we're quoting it. B'shat milchama, if it's the middle of a war, meaning they're a foreign troop, they're coming in as part of a big war, and it's not calm. Then elu ve'elu mutarot, both barrels that were open and closed are mutar after they leave, whatever wine is left behind. because they didn't have the presence of mind, they didn't have the freedom, they didn't have the security to do what the nisuch, they were running through town. It's the middle of a war. But what you see from this Mishnah is Alma Kivan de Ba'iti, since they were, Bita literally means afraid or nervous, lo menaschi, they won't do what they would normally have done, which we worry about nisuch, pouring the wine for Avodah Zarah. Achanami, so here too, it could be Kivan de Bi'at lo ati leharhuri. Maybe here too, since Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Zera reported this about Rabbi Avo, since he's nervous and he's anxious and he's very worried, then maybe it's not a problem if he touches himself because he's focused on something else entirely, and so there's no concern that will lead to an erection and shechvat zera. So well, what's he worried about here? What do you mean? Hachamai biyatuta? What's he nervous about when he goes into the pool to swim? About covering himself? About why if he's touching himself then, or you think he won't be thinking about anything inappropriate or won't lead to anything inappropriate? Says the Gemara, it's biyatuta dinahara. It's because they would go swimming in rivers, and of course, they went to the mikveh, let's say, he was washing before Yom Tov for Shabbos, right? Going to the river, of course, you're always terrified that the river's going to sweep you away and that you're going to drown. And so because you're totally fixated on staying safe and staying upright in the river, even if he touched himself, there wouldn't be any concern, maybe, we don't know this, that he's going to lead to an erection into shechvat zera because he's too focused on staying alive, on not drowning. And so that's why he says, I didn't know necessarily if he touched himself or not. Ask the Gemara now. I don't get to the whole story. Why was he covering himself? Anyone who puts their hands in front of their genitals when they're going to the mikveh or going swimming, I don't think they had swim trunks back then, right? Anyone who covers themselves, it's a very bad thing. It's like they're embarrassed by their circumcision. So it's like they're trying to hide that they're part of a Brit. So how could Ravina said, I saw there would be a Vo covered himself? Lo kasha, haki nachet, haki salik. It depends whether you're going down into the river or coming up from the river. Right? If you're going down into the river, your back is to the population. And so you shouldn't cover yourself. You shouldn't put your hands in front of yourself as if you're embarrassed by your circumcision, by your Brit Milah. When you're coming up from the river, of course, you should cover yourself. You should cover yourself because you're facing everyone. It's a full frontal, and you got to cover yourself up. Now, it's interesting because even when you're coming up, this is when he covered himself, and we said he's still worried about the water, right? So clearly, he still was worried about getting out of the water and not falling back in or slipping. But when he was facing people, that's when it makes sense to cover yourself. And that's Kihad de Rava. Rava, when he would come out of the water, Shachi, he would bend over to hide himself, right? So he would try to conceal his genitals. Rabbi Zera, on the other hand, was proud. Zakif, he would stand up tall. He didn't hide anything. He wanted to show that he was proud of his Brit Milah. And Rabbanan, the Beit Rav Ashi, in the the students, the Rabbanan, in the Beit Midrash of Rav Ashi, Kika Nachti Zakvi, when they were going down, they would stand up tall because again, people were seeing their backs. So there's nothing to hide. But Kika Salki, when they were coming out of the water, Shachi, they would bend over and try to be discreet about their nudity. And so that's acceptable. Okay, the next story, Rabbi Zera, it's about Rabbi Zera as well. Rabbi Zera had become mishtamit mid Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Zera was at a period in his life when he was hiding from Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Rabbi Yehuda was his teacher, but Rabbi Zera, was boy lemesek la'aretz Yisrael. Rabbi Zera had gotten into his mind that he wanted to make Aliyah. He wanted to go from Bavel. Rabbi Yehuda lived in Bavel, I think in Naharda. And Rabbi Zera wanted to go to Aretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Yehuda did not approve of that. Dama Rabbi Yehuda is quoted as saying, Kol ha'oleh mi Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, over ba'aseh. Anyone who goes up from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael is over an aseh. The pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, Shenem, of course it's not a Doraita, it's a pasuk in Navi, but the pasuk says, Bavela yuva'u, they'll be brought to Bavel, which was the prophecy about Gullus, Vishama yiyu, they'll go. I am sorry we're started a little early, Shavua Tov, because we all have to clean up, but it was early. But it says in the pasuk, Bavela yuva'u, in Yirmiyahu, they'll go to Bavel, Vishama yiyu, and they'll stay there. This is a very Satmar pasuk, right? This is a Satmar pasuk, by the way. That that you should never leave exile until you get the message to leave, right? So
Well, it's
Rabbi
also saying how
Yehuda,
great Bavel was.
I'm sorry?
Maybe the Torah learning was on a higher level in Bavel than in Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it wasn't
Well,
just,
so we might have been behind you. The Gemara in Ksubas goes through this. That's where we have the main sugya about these oaths.
right.
That's where all Satmar comes from, right? Or at least modern Satmar.
It wasn't, it wasn't
sorry?
just, we can't go to Israel because of Mashiachut, because of Mashiach. It was also that, why would you leave Bavel for less Torah or something?
I mean, I agree, but this specific verse he's quoting literally. The Gemara quotes here the Gemara in Ketubot, which says that other people read the pasuk is referring to the Klei Sharet, the parts of the temple that were brought to Bavel that would stay there, but not the people. But either way, the bottom line was his Rebbe, Rav Yehuda, did not want him to go up. He wanted to go. So what he did very cleverly, as people have been doing for all time, right, is he avoided his Rebbe. So that if he didn't find him, there was no email back then, right? So as long as you avoid him, he can't tell you not to go. Clearly, Reb Zera knew that he didn't want him to go. But he also, in avoiding his Rebbe, he started feeling very sad because he was missing out on learning from him, right? Because it's hard when you avoid someone to learn from them. So finally, Reb Zera said, Ezel v'eshma minei milti, I will go and Amar, he said, Ezel v'eshma minei milti, let me go try to learn something from him by, watching his actions. I mean, I don't want to go to the shir, because then he'll tell me not to go to Israel, but let me go watch his actions and see if I can learn something. Ve'iti ve'asik, and I'll take it and I'll learn from him. So Reb Zera went, Ashkechei dekab beibani. He found Rav Yehuda going to the bathhouse, going for a swim. And he heard Rav Yehuda, Kamar le l'shameh, Rav Yehuda said to his attendant, Hevioli netter, bring me nectar. Now nectar you'll recognize is not an Aramaic word, it's a word from the Torah, which we use all the time. Nectar means like shampoo, Rashi is shampoo, but like some kind of a cleansing solution. Havili masrek, bring me a masrek, which again means a comb, but it's again not a word that's Aramaic. It's a biblical word. And he continued. So we'll see what he learned from those things. But those were unusual words for Rav Yehuda to use. And he said, in the bathhouse, pitchu pumaychu va'afik havla. He said, open your mouth. Or I opened his mouth, and he, the steam came out from his mouth. So he blew out afik havla. And furthermore, v'ishtu mimaya de beibani. And he saw that he was drinking from the water of the bathhouse. Sounds pretty disgusting, but he was also drinking a little bit when he went in the water. These are all things that Reb Zera saw Reb Yehuda did when he was, hiding behind the pillar. So Amar, he said, Reb Zera said to himself, Ilmale bati el shmo davar zeh dai. It's a good thing I came just to hear him do all these things. These are all really informative and interesting halachot. What are they? So Bishlama haviyu netter haviyu masrek. When he said, bring a netter, bring masrek, what was the chiddush that Reb Zera learned from that? Is kamash malan dvarim shalchom mutar la'amram b'lashon hakodesh. Right? You might have thought that you're not supposed to use lashon hakodesh for things that are not holy. So how could you have modern Hebrew, which is what some people would argue against, right? How could you speak and use when you're in the bathhouse, when you're clearly not talking about Torah or anything? Why would you use words from the Torah that are lashon hakodesh? What you see from Rav Yehuda is that it's okay. It's not a problem. You can use Hebrew as a modern language. So that was interesting. The next thing he learned from him was he saw that he was patchu pumaychu, he said open his mouth, afik havla, and the steam came out. That's Kiddush Shmuel. The Amar Shmuel, havla mapik havla. That if you Rashi explains that if you sort of the steam of the bathroom also goes into your mouth, that you want to open your mouth while you're there so you could absorb some of the steam and cleanse your insides as well as your outsides. But however, the third thing, el ishtu maya de bebani my malyuta. Why did he drink some of the water of the bathhouse? What do you gain from doing that? That's Titania. In fact, there's a Braita which suggests that that's a good practice. And the Braita has the following behaviors. Says the Braita, achavalo shata, if a person eats food but doesn't drink anything with it, achilato dam. It's like he ate blood. Zehu tchilat chole me'ayin. That's where you start getting, that's the beginning, initiation of intestinal diseases. So you got to wash down what you eat with a lot of liquid.
Stay hydrated.
Achav v'lo halach arba amot. If a person eats but doesn't move 4 amot, which is a very minimal amount, right? 6 or 7 feet. Let's say you sit in bed and you eat and you don't move afterwards. Achilato mirakevet. The food will rot inside of you. It doesn't get a chance to move around. And zeo tchilat reach ra. That will lead to foul smell, so that you're not gonna, food will literally, it'll rot inside of you, but it means that it won't, you'll have bad breath or you'll have bad smell from your skin, but that's a bad behavior. Let's say a person has to go to the bathroom, they feel full, and instead of, or they can't go, but they eat another meal, then that you're like adding stuff on top, right? It's like you put wood into an oven without clearing out the ashes, which is a very apt mushal, right? So you're not clearing out what's in the intestines, you put more stuff on top of them. And zo tchilat reach zuhama. That leads to the reach of zuhama, which again, zuhama is, Rashi says it means that you have like a sweat that comes out, like you're constantly sweating and smelling, and it leads to a very unpleasant smell. Rachatz bechamin, if a person washes in hot water, like we normally do, below shata mehem, but you don't drink a little bit of the water to cleanse your innards, then doma letanur she'esiku mi b'chutz lo yesiku mi b'fnim. It's like you have an oven where you put coals on the outside but not on the inside, meaning you didn't clean the inside. So that was what he learned. This is why we're bringing the story from Yehuda, that it's important when you go to the bathhouse, I hope it's clean water, that you also swallow a little bit of the water so that you clean out your insides, not just your outside. Continued the brisa though. Rachatz bechamin. Let's say you wash in hot water, but you don't go immediately afterwards and take a cold shower to wash it off. Then domel barzel shichnisu, or it's like a piece of metal, a piece of iron, I guess, that you put into the fire to heat and to forge. But but you didn't put into cold water afterwards, which is important, as we learned today's daf, which is very, very important for strengthening the metal. That when you heat up a metal, it's always helpful afterwards to put it in cold, which strengthens the bonds that you have newly formed. Rachatz v'lo sach, if you wash but don't anoint yourself, don't put oil, or maybe this is soap in our language, but sach usually means cream. After you bathe, then doma lemayim agabe chavit. It's like you poured water on top of a barrel, which means one interpretation is that it just washes right off. It doesn't stay retained. Or Rashi's language is that the water only goes on the outside, but not on the inside. So I guess it means you lose all the moisture. So you have to anoint yourself to keep the moisture in. Anyways, that was the Braita, and that was what he learned from Rabbi Yehuda, even when he was not going to the shir, because he was trying to avoid his Rebbe, who would not approve of his aliyah. So that's the lesson. Continues the Mishnah. The next halacha is mulyar. Let's say you have a mulyar. I don't know if anyone has English. I don't know how you would translate mulyar, but it's some kind of a samovar, or something that you keep hot water in. I don't know if there's an English word for it.
No, it said milarium. It said a vessel used for heating water. It doesn't say more than that.
Okay, there you go. So we'll see in the Gemara exactly what it is, but it's some kind of vessel that's garuf, meaning you cleared out the coals. So it's something where we'll see in the Gemara where, but there was a space basically for coals in this thing, and the container has water. You put the coals in, it heats up the water, right? And before Shabbat started, you cleared out the coals, and the water, the boiling hot water, is inside this container. So says the Mishnah, shotin himeno b'Shabbat, you can drink from the container on Shabbat, but if it's an antichi, and we'll see what an antichi is, it's another kind of container for boiling water, then afa pisha grufa, even if you clear out the coals before Shabbat, ein shotin himeno, you can't drink from it on Shabbat. What does this mean? It says, hechi dami mulyar hagaruf. What is a mulyar that the Mishnah talked about? Tana, the Braita learned, it's a case where you have mayim mibifnim ugichalim mibechutz, where you have, imagine a container, and on the outside of the container is like a sleeve that's attached where you put the coals. So the container has water, the sleeve is open, you put, imagine it's metal, of course, right? Not plastic. You put coals into the sleeve, it heats up the whole container and makes your water. So that is a mulyar, and if you take out the coals, you can use it on Shabbat. Antichi, what's an antichi? So Rabba Amar Bekiri. Rabba says it's like an oven. Remember, Kira is the name of our parrot. So basically, it's like an oven where you have a couple chambers, and one chamber has water and one chamber has coals. Rashi says that's very, very hot because the walls of the oven become very hot with the coals, and even when you clear out the coals, it retains a lot of heat. Toast is a little bothered by that because we said earlier that if you take the coals out of the oven, you can use the oven. So why, if it's talking about before Shabbat and you took out the coals, why is it a problem? But either way, it's an oven. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Beidodi. It's talking about a Beidodi, which is, again, it's a little not clear, but probably what it means is that it's basically a container that has two chambers inside of it and one top. And you pour coals into the bottom chamber and pour the water on the top chamber, and then you cover it. And so the coals are underneath and separate from the water, but they heat up the water. So now you take out the coals before Shabbat. But the reason this is a problem, presumably, I'm going to read the end of the Gemara. I'll tell you the end of the Gemara before I read it. The reason it's a problem, presumably, is that because it's covered, even though you took out the coals, the heat is retained very strongly in that bottom chamber, and it continues to heat the water on Shabbat, and so it's as if you're cooking on Shabbat when you use this thing. But with the first case, the mulyar, because the coals were on the side, and Rashi thinks the difference is because there's no cover on the side. So because you take out the coals and it's open to the air, it doesn't retain the heat, and therefore it's not well insulated, and so it becomes like it's not cooking while you're on Shabbat. So that's the difference between the two. Says the Gemara, Manda Amar Beit Dodi, if you say that when there's a container underneath that it is usher on Shabbat, Kol Shekain Beit Kiri, which remains even more heat, because it's like a full oven. Manda Amar Beit Kiri, but the one who says that it's talking about an oven, like Ava Beit Dodi lo. But then if it was a Beit Dodi, again, it's not like an oven, but it's got two different chambers, then it would be mutar, again, as long as you took out the coals before Shabbat. Tanya Kavatei de Rav Nachman. There's a Braita that supports Rav Nachman who said it's Beit Dodi. And the Braita says, Antichi, Afal Pisha Gufa Ktuma, Ein Shotin Himenu. You can't drink from it on Shabbat. Nipnei Shenichoshta Mitchamimata. Because it's Nichoshta. So Rashi has one explanation, Nichoshta is a metal, right? Nichoshta is a metal. Rashi doesn't like that. He says what Nichoshta actually probably means is the sides. Nichoshta is a word for Nichushtayim, or not. He brings a couple of quotes from the Mishnah. And he says that Nichoshet is the side of a container or a separate chamber. And so what it means is that the other chamber continues to heat it up. And again, Rashi says the difference between a mulyar and an antichi is whether the side chamber is covered or not covered. So therefore, it remains usher if the heat continues to heat the water on Shabbat. Continues the next Mishnah. Ha-mecham shepino. Mecham is another word for a container of hot water. Rashi says kumkumam, right? Or kumkum. So let's say you have a mecham of hot water and you're pinohu and you clear it out on Shabbat. Now, it's not so clear what pinohu means, but let's say one interpretation of pinohu is that you poured out the hot water. So you just have a container that previously contained boiling hot water. So obviously the container is very hot. Says the Mishnah, lo yitain letochot sonein. You should not put cold water into that boiling hot container on Shabbat, b'shvil sheyichamu, in order for them to get hotter. Avon notein hu letocho, but you can put it inside of it. What does that mean? The Gemara is going to ask. O letochakos kedei lahavshiran, or you can put the water, presumably, from this kumkum into a kos to make water lukewarm. Havshiran means to warm them up and not boil them. So what does that mean? It says where my kamar. How do you understand the Mishnah? Amar of Adar Matna Hachi Kamar. This is what the Mishnah means. Ha-mecham shepina mimenu mayim chamin. If you take the water out of the mecham, so you cleared out the water, the boiling hot water, then lo yutein litocho mayim mu'atim k'dei sheyichambo. Let's say you have this 40-gallon jug, right? You shouldn't put 3 gallons into it, which will, obviously you have the relationship of heat to volume, right? So the heat will condense into a very small volume and boil that water, basically. You can put a large amount of water into it because they won't boil. It will get warm, but it won't become boiling hot because you don't have enough, the volume is so high that there won't be enough heat in this container to boil that water. So that's what's mutar. And that's what our Mishnah meant, that you can't pour a little bit of water into this container if it's empty because it'll get very hot, but you can pour a lot of water. Ask the Gemara, but how can you pour a container of cold water into a kli that's very hot? Hello mitzaref. That will strengthen the kli. As we just discussed, whenever you take a metal and you heat it up, and then you pour cold water into it right afterwards, that strengthens the bond in it. So if you have this boiling hot container that's empty, and then you pour cold water into it, you're actually fashioning the container, you're strengthening it. And so why isn't that a malacha on Shabbat of tziruf, of really it's makah b'patish, but it's a malacha of finishing something that's making it work better. So how could you pour cold water on Shabbat? Says the Gemara, it's Rabbi Shimoni. It's Rabbi Shimon. Damar, davar she'ein mitkavein, mutar. You poured the water in because you wanted to get warm. You didn't put the water in because you want the kli to become stronger. And so relying on Rabbi Shimon, anything you're not mitkavein to do is mutar on Shabbat. So since you were not intending to strengthen the kli, it's mutar. Matkifla Abaya asked Abaya midi mecham shepina mimenu mayim katani. If you look back at our Mishnah, the words in the Mishnah are mecham shepinahu. You cleared out the mecham. It doesn't say a mecham that was cleared out of water. It says mecham shepinahu katani. And therefore, says Abaya, the way I understand the Mishnah is hachikam. Ha-mecham shepinahu. You cleared out, meaning you cleared out the coals from the mecham. So there's no heat left in the mecham. The yeshbo mayim chamim, but you still have the water in the mecham. You have boiling hot water in this kumkum, right, in this container. Then lo yitem letochom mayim mu'atim b'shvil sheyichamu. You shouldn't put a little bit of water into you have 40 gallons of boiling hot water. You shouldn't put a gallon of water into that which will boil from it or get really hot. Maybe not boil, but get really hot. Aval, the Mishnah is saying, notein letochom mayim merubim. You can put tons of water in, or lots of water. They'll have shiram to cool the whole thing down, right? So let's say you have 40 gallons or whatever, 40 gallons of boiling hot water. You can put 40 gallons of cold water, which will make it all warm, right? So then you have a lot of warm water for your bath, but you're not actually boiling anything. And then the second part of the Mishnah, according to Abaya now, is mecham shepina mimenu mayim. If you empty out the mecham entirely, then lo yitem letochom mayim kol ikar. You shouldn't put any water into it. Why not? Because we're worried that if it's empty and it's boiling hot, and you remember the kli is empty, there's no water in it, but it's a hot container of metal. If you put cold water into it, you're going to strengthen it. And because you're going to strengthen it, it's asur on Shabbat, even if it's not your intention. Because Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yehuda, damar davar she'ein mitkavein asur. And says Abaya, therefore we're going according to Rabbi Yehuda, in fact, who says you can't put any water into it because not because you're going to heat up the water necessarily, which you will too, but even if it's a large amount of water, you can't do it because you're going to strengthen the kli, and strengthening the kli is an isser on Shabbat. I'm going to read a little bit more, but then we got to stop. Like kids crying, it sounds like. Amar Rav, lo shanu el hafshir. The only thing, says Rav, the only time you're allowed to pour water into this hot container on Shabbat is to make the water warm. Avalitzaref, if the point of pouring it in is to strengthen the container, then asur. And Shmuel says, afilu litzaref nami mutar. Even if your point is to strengthen the container, it's also mutar. This is where that's ridiculous. Litzaref lechatchila mishari. Who would allow you to pour water lichatchila into a kli on Shabbat to make it stronger? If you understand Rav and Shmuel, you have to read it this way. Itmar. What would you say? Amar Rav. Rav is saying lo shanu ela shir lahavshir. You can only pour the amount of water that would become warm by putting it into this empty, boiling hot vessel. Avol shir litzaref. If you pour so much in that it's going to, and Rashi explains this means you fill up the whole kli, so you're going to strengthen the whole thing, then it's asur. And Shmuel says, afilu shir litzaref mutar, that even if you pour in so much that you're going to fill up the whole kli, and it's almost certain that you're going to strengthen the kli and cause tziruf, it's still mutar. And why would that be? It's because Shmuel must hold like Rabbi Shimon, that davar she'eino mitkavein is mutar. Says the Gemara, Lememra, are you trying to tell me the Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Svirlei, that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon, that a davar she'en mitkaven is mutar? V'ha'amar Shmuel, but Shmuel is quoted as saying, and this is a very interesting halacha, that if, let's say, you have a coal that is in a Reshut HaRabim on Shabbat, right? And it's going to burn things down. It's going to burn down someone's hut. It's going to blow up someone's car, right? It's a boiling hot coal. Normally on Shabbat, you cannot extinguish a coal. The reason you can't, this is very interesting. The reason you can't extinguish a coal is not because necessarily you're putting out a fire. Well, it is because you're putting out a fire. But the real reason is because you're making you're making something that's functional, right? When you put out a fire on a piece of wood, you're creating a coal essentially that you could then use at a later time to burn. Therefore, says Shmuel, if you have a gachel shel matechet, let's say you have a hot nugget of metal, you can actually extinguish that on Shabbat, say with water, Reshut HaRabim, if it's in public, to save the public from trouble. Because since you are since it's made out of metal, you basically, there's no benefit, there's nothing constructive. It doesn't become more useful by putting it out. However, says Shmuel, but if it's made out of wood and it's left in public and it's a nuisance, right? Someone's going to step on this and burn themselves, or you're going to have to move all the cars, whatever, they have to drive around it. You can't put it out on Shabbat. Why? So Rashi explains that, and we'll get to this later in the Masechet, that a gachelet shel eitz is an isser midoraita. Putting it out is an isser of kiboy because you're making a coal. But a gachelet of metal, because by putting it out, you're not doing anything constructive, is only isser midrabanan. So Shmuel is basically saying you can do an isser midrabanan to help the public, but you can't do an isser midoraita. But I don't understand. You're not putting this out in order to make a coal, right? If you're putting it out in order to save people from the danger. And that's what we call a malacha she'eno tzricha legufa, right? That's called a malacha where you don't need the function of what you're doing. You're not trying to make a coal. You're trying to save people from getting burned. And Shmuel, presumably, if he holds like Rabbi Shimon about davar she'eno mitkavein, would also hold like Rabbi Shimon about malacha she'eno tzricha legufa. Says the Gemara, the fourth line, Savar like Rabbi Shimon afilu shel eitz nami. If he holds like Rabbi Shimon, why can't you put out a fire that's made out of wood, even though you're making a coal? Right? It should be mutar because it's a malacha she'eno tzricha legufa. The malacha is making a coal. That's not the purpose of you putting it out. You're putting it out in order to save people from being burned. Says the Gemara, it's because he doesn't necessarily hold like that opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The davar she'en mitkavein several like Rabbi Shimon. When it's a malacha that you're not trying to do, he holds like Rabbi Shimon. So think of the distinction here. It's very important. But here you have a hot water container. You have a piece of metal. You pour water into the metal in order to cool down the water, in order to heat up the water, sorry. But your goal is for the cold water to be impacted heat coming from the metal, right? So you can't say it's a davar, it's a malacha she'eno tzricha legufa. You're trying to do exactly what you did. You're trying to put the water in to cool down the container, to warm up the water by taking heat from the container. By definition, that's going to strengthen the container. So you are it's a malacha she'tzricha legufa. You want to do the malacha, but you're not mitkavein to make the container stronger. You're doing it in order to heat up the water. So there, b'davar she'en mitkavein, he does hold like Rabbi Shimon. But by malacha she'eno tzricha legufa, savar like Rabbi Yehuda, there he holds like Rabbi Yehuda that it's aser. And says Ravina, very interestingly, since Shmuel told us that an isser midrabanan you can go against in order to help the public, hilkach. Therefore, practically, if there's a kotz, Reshut HaRabim, if you find that there's a needle, not really a needle, but something that's a thorn that can cause people damage, that's placed in a Reshut HaRabim when Shabbat starts, you can be molicho pachot mi'arba amot. You can move it out of the Reshut HaRabim by relying on the leniency of you can't move 4 amot at once, or pick it up and move 4 feet and then stop and do another 4 feet, another 4 feet. You can do that because even though it's an isser midrabanan to do that, you're allowed to go over an isser drabanan in order to help the public. And if it's in a karmelet, afilu tuva. If it's in a karmelet, which as we learned earlier and we'll discuss much more, is not a Reshut HaRabim, but is a public space. So there, the isser to carry in general is only midrabanan. And therefore, you can pick this up and carry it as much as you want in order to save the public from being damaged. And so we rely, and we do practically rely on this for many things, but this is the heter of Shmuel, that Isser Shvut and Isser Midrabanan can be abrogated on Shabbat in order to benefit the tzibur, the public. And of course, the halacha, there's many, many applications of that, but for now, we'll just deal with thorns in the Rosh Hashanah that can be moved, or dangerous things, if needed, in a way that is over an Isser Midrabanan, as long as it's not an Isser Midoraita. We'll stop there. Hopefully Dov is going to be in tomorrow on Membet, and then God willing, I will be back Saturday night at 9:00, we said.
Thank you.
Welcome all. Enjoy your chametz.
Thanks very much. It was
Bye.
great. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.